person, as a child, you understand? A couple of years after that, they built an apartment for the Rebbe and the Rebbitzen next door to 770 because it became impossible for the Rebbe to walk. The Rebbe used to walk home. Shabbos, Friday night and Shabbos, she was in the house. If you want to talk about a person who doesn't come out into the street, the Rebbitzen never went to shul. The Rebbitzen never went to shul. She didn't even go to shul for Yizkir. Now, who doesn't go to shul for Yizkir? Now, I think, I don't know this for certain, but I have reasons to believe, more than reasons to believe, that for the first 20 years after the Rebbe became Rebbe, she had a shul next door. The house east of the house that the Rebbe and the Rebbitzen live, if you go to the President Street, the house the Rebbe and the Rebbitzen live, the house which is closer to Kingston, next to this house, belongs to a non-Jew. That house belonged to the Boston Rebbe. The Boston Rebbe had a shul and he had a mikveh in his home. People say that the Rebbe used to sneak into his mikveh on occasion because the Rebbe didn't use the mikveh publicly that often. And people also say that the Rebbe didn't daven there. As long as that shul was next door, she davened there because the Rebbe didn't have a problem going to a shul. She had a problem going to a shul where she would be recognized. I know a Yid who has a shul, an Ashkenaz shul in Crown Heights, that's David Gershon, who told me, and again, this is me piecing pieces of a puzzle together, hopefully correctly, that when the Boston moved out of the neighborhood, the next year, the Rebbe came to daven in his shul. She came only once. She sat in the back row. And I suspect that she decided that she was being given too much attention even there, so she didn't go to shul. It was very important to the Rebbitzen not to be treated as such. She wanted to be like everybody else. She didn't want to be noticed. She wanted to be treated, and so on. In case you don't know, the Rebbitzen worked her whole adult life. She worked in the Central Library of New York, and there's a lot of evidence that during the war years she actually worked with the Rebbe as an engineer. The Rebbitzen was an engineer, apparently. There's a fellow just now who did an interview named Roth, who says that when the Rebbe went to the Navy Yard, he went with the Rebbitzen. They went together. The Rebbitzen worked as an engineer. But later on, I guess after the war was over, she worked as a librarian. She worked in the library. She worked as a librarian. In other words, it wasn't like she stayed in the house because she didn't like people. She stayed in the house because she didn't like attention. And as long as you treated her like everybody else, which was really only possible if you didn't know who she was perfectly fine. The minute people would discover who she was, she would disappear. Because she really didn't want any attention. She really didn't want any public image. There used to be a bakery on North Strand Avenue called Lowen's Bakery. And she used to go Friday, Vaib Chala, like anybody else, with her sister, and they would stand in line, and somebody noticed her one week and told the people ahead of her in line, I don't know if you know, but this is the Lubavitcher Rebbitzen. So the line disappeared. She went to the counter, she purchased her challah, never went to the store again. She ordered, she didn't went to the store again. Anyway, so they built this house, this apartment next to 770, and the Rebbitzen would come every week and spend Shabbos with the Rebbe in the apartment. And this was very special, very nice. Shabbos and Yom Tov, the Rebbe and the Rebbitzen were together, because for a year or two, the Rebbe stayed in his room, and she was by herself on President Street, which is so sad. So they finally built this apartment, and the Rebbitzen would come right before Shabbos and leave right after Shabbos. And people who had seichel understood that they shouldn't stand there and watch her. Her Shalom would drive her down the driveway, and there was a basement, there was a set of stairs that she would go in. Anyway, the story is told that a couple of boys saw her car coming, and they went to look at her, and she ran, and she fell, and she broke her hip. She didn't want to be seen. There's a story that goes around now about a boy who was running to 770 late after Shabbos to catch Maidiv, and he smashed into her. She was waiting on Union Street because Shalom would pick her up after Shabbos. And when he smashed into her, she grabbed a hold of the gate and she turned her face away. He wrote her an apology letter the next day, and her response was, I deliberately did not look. I didn't want to see who you were. Why did you apologize? I didn't want to know who it was. That was who she was. So this was the Rebbitzen that none of us knew. Literally none of us knew. Now, she knew a lot of people. And you heard so much about all the people who knew her, but I was not in that circle. I didn't know her at all. And then she passed away. The Rebbitzen passed away in the middle of the night. The Rebbe had not been feeling well, and there was a conference apparently of doctors, either Sunday or Monday in the house, in which the Rebbe personally participated. They talked over her condition. She sat in on a meeting, and it was decided that she was examined, and her situation was stable. She was getting weaker, but her situation was stable. And at a certain point, the decision was made that she should be hospitalized just to do tests. That's what happened, really. And the Rebbe was going to accompany her to the hospital, and she said to the Rebbe that he should stay home. Now, I may be wrong, but I think that when the Rebbitzen went to the doctor, to the hospital, the Rebbe, as a rule, went along. In other words, if she went to the hospital during the day, in other words, if the Rebbe was in shul, he was in shul, but this was in the middle of the night. The fact that the Rebbe did not accompany the Rebbitzen, I think, is very significant. He was not there when she passed away. They took her to the hospital. She asked for a glass of water. She made a bracha, and she passed away just like that. Waiting. She was in a wheelchair, waiting for a room. The Rebbe was informed. She was brought back to Crown Heights. 7 o'clock in the morning, the alarm sounded. 7 o'clock, they have the alarm that rings Friday afternoon, yeah? That alarm was actually put in to announce Fabrengens and Siches and so on. When the Rebbitzen passed away, the alarm sounded. I remember the alarm ringing at 7 in the morning. It was very eerie. It was very unsettling. It didn't make sense. And we all found out that the Rebbitzen passed away. The Levaya, I think, was at noon. The Levaya went from the Rebbe's house. The Rebbe followed the Aron. The Rebbe walked. I was in front of the Rebbe's house. I watched the Rebbe walk down the steps and follow behind the Aron. And they walked till Kingston. For the Rebbe, it was very hard to walk. The plan was they were going to walk till Kingston and President, down President Eastern Parkway, then past 770, all on foot. And at a certain point, the Rebbe turned around to Rabbi Groner and said, "Where's the car?" He Pashat couldn't walk. So the Rebbe got into the car and the Levaya left. The way the Levaya was done was basically that they kept us out of the cemetery. I mean, I went to the Levaya and I stood by one of the fences, not letting people in. That was my job. There were many, many people in the cemetery, but when the Rebbe's mother had passed away, the Rebbe was very unhappy with how people were behaving, particularly the Bochurim. And they tried to effect that the Rebbitzen's Levaya would actually be attended within the cemetery by few people. People stood outside. I didn't see the cemetery at all. There's pictures of the Levaya. I was not there at all. And the Rebbe flew back to Crown Heights. The Rebbe came back to his home, and then something really, really very surprising occurred. The Rebbe opened his home. Now, I'm telling you this story 30 years later, so it's very hard for you to understand hindsight. The Rebbe's house was off limits. The Rebbe's house was nobody's business. And I'll qualify it. In the tradition of Lubavitch, and I'm sure it's not just Lubavitch, it's tradition of all Rebbes, the private and the public of a Rebbe were very intertwined. There really was a very, very gray area between what was personal and what was public. In the Chabad tradition, there was no such thing as a Rebbe is not available. If you needed a bracha at 2 in the morning, you got a bracha at 2 in the morning. You needed a bracha at 5 in the morning, or 5 in the morning. The Rebbe never slept, or whenever he slept. But there was no such thing as the Rebbe goes home and the business shuts down until the next morning. I heard that an older chassid who had been in Lubavitch came to Crown Heights the first time. And in the evening, the Rebbe got into a car, and he said, "Where's the Rebbe going?" And they told him the Rebbe is going home. When is the Rebbe coming back? The Rebbe is coming back in the morning, which in those days probably meant, unless it was Monday and Thursday, and there was Kiyas HaTeira, around noon. The Rebbe used to leave 12 o'clock at night, 1 in the morning. After Yechidus, he could leave 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, and he would come back at noon, sometimes 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And he asked, and if somebody needs the Rebbe between now and tomorrow morning, so he said, the Rebbe's not available. He started crying. Because in Lubavitch there was no such thing as an unavailable Rebbe. It was no such thing. The Rebbe was available 24 hours a day. Now, people who had connections with the Rebbitzen, the Rebbitzen told Rabbi Lipsker, who mentioned before, that he could call any time, day or night. And he did. If he had an emergency, if he had people who needed help, and it was very important, he'd call even 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 6 in the morning. The Rebbitzen always picked up the phone on the first ring. Nobody knows when these people slept. They did very little sleeping. And she would go into the Rebbe and come back and answer and so on and so forth. So with connections, the Rebbe was available. But to the typical Lubavitcher, if you had a crisis, if you had an emergency, and it was in the middle of the night, and you couldn't, the secretariat was closed, the office was closed. That's how it was. And all of a sudden, the Rebbe opened his home. The Rebbe's home became open. The moment the Rebbe passed away, the Rebbe opened his home. And from that moment forward, there was no longer night in Lubavitch. Because when the Rebbe was at home, there was a secretary there all the time. And people called in the middle of the night. And even if the Rebbe was not available for direct contact, there would be like a table placed in front of the Rebbe's door, and you would put down notes, and the Rebbe would periodically open his door and read these notes, and there'd be, all night long, there were things coming in and out. There was the idea that the Rebbe goes home and then he's not available till the morning end of the day that Rebbitzen passed away. Whether the Rebbe was at home or in 770. For example, the Rebbe was never left alone. There was always somebody there. It was either a secretary, there were Bochurim who were given instructions, and the phone would ring, and they'd write notes, and they'd put them on a table outside the Rebbe's door. They would never knock on the door, and every half hour or so the door would open, and you see the Rebbe's hand reach out and pull in whatever papers were there, and he would read them, and then he'd put answers back, and you could take them and call people back a half an hour later, an hour later, and so on. And this was a very, very significant change. But there's two parts to it. The first part is that all of a sudden the Rebbe was available 24 hours a day. But the second part was the Rebbe opened his home. The Rebbe's house was so off limits, it almost didn't exist in our imagination. And all of a sudden we're marching into the Rebbe's house. They took away some of the furniture, and they made the Rebbe's largest living room, I don't know what it's called, living room or dining, whatever room it is, into a shul, and they put an Aron Kodesh, which is there until this very day. And for that year, the Rebbe davened for the Yomit, and he was, except for Shabbos and Yom Tif, for the most part, the Rebbe was home. During the year of Avelis, the Rebbe was at home almost the entire year. Subsequent years, it would fluctuate. The Rebbe would come to 770, and he'd go home for periods, and come back to 770, and go home for periods. I remember when I got married. I got married in 1989, the end of December 1989. And we all look forward to coming to 770 for your chuppah, that the Rebbe's there. And I walked to 770, and the Rebbe's lights are out. And I turned to Rabbi Klein, who happens to my uncle. Where's the Rebbe? He said, the Rebbe went home. I was so disappointed. The Rebbe wasn't by my chuppah. So he consoled me and said, don't worry, if you can be by your chuppah from his room, it can be by your chuppah from President Street as well. But as time went on, the Rebbe went home less and less. And at a certain point, it almost seems like the Rebbe stopped going home altogether. He lived in 770. But whether he was at home or at 770, he was available 24 hours a day. Going into the Rebbe's home, for me at that time, seemed like an invasion. It seemed like such an invasion because it was so foreign to us. It was very, very, very foreign to us. So I didn't do it. The Rebbe opened his home. The Rebbe passed away at midnight, like 1 a.m, on Tuesday to Wednesday. The same exact tree as this year. Chof Beishvat was on a Wednesday. And we got the news in the morning. If the people were near 770, they knew during the night. The alarm rang at 7 a.m, and it woke us up and told us that there's something happening that's unusual. The Rebbe came back from the Levaya probably around 2:30 or 2:45, I don't know exactly. And by the way, it's known that when the Rebbe was told that the Rebbitzen passed away, the first thing the Rebbe said, and this is how the rumor, I heard it then, the Kinder, the Shluchen. You should tell her children. Kama, the Shluchen. The Rebbe wanted to give people an opportunity to come to the Levaya, and they quickly spread word wherever they could. People came from wherever they could, if they could get on flights, to come to be by the Levaya. That mincha was open only to Shluchim. Because the Shluchim came from wherever they were and had to go back. So they came to the Levaya, and then they went into the Rebbe's home, the Rebbe mincha, and the Rebbe spoke. After mincha, the first day the Rebbe said a sicha, and he talked about the idea of Nicham Avelim, that you're not supposed to console a mourner for the first 3 days. Not supposed to console a mourner and it was the first day. So the Rebbe said, so consoling a mourner, which you're not supposed to do for 3 days, is halacha l'meshe misina. It's not in the Chumash explicitly. But v'ahavta lecha kamoicha is one of the Tayag mitzvahs, and that applies all the time. So if you're doing Nicham Avelim, gotta wait a couple of days. But if you're doing Nicham Avelim with Avas Yisrael, you can do it at any time. That was basically what the Rebbe said. And the Rebbe sat shiva, and every day, 3 times a day, the Rebbe's door would open. So for davening, there were rules about who was allowed in. And after davening, each one of the 3 tefillahs, people would line up, and the Rebbe would sit, and everybody would walk by Menachem Oval. And you could come, if you wanted, you could have been Menachem Oval 15 times. You go every tefillah, you walk by the Rebbe, say, I'm welcome, and move on. I was not in the Rebbe's home. I didn't go in. I couldn't do it. So I didn't see this, but you can see that there were no pictures supposed to be taken. There was no video taken. There's audio. But some non-Lubavitchers took some pictures, and I've seen them. The Rebbe sat in Talmud film. After Shachar, the Rebbe sat in Talmud film, and people would march by and they would Menachem Ovel. And when people of prominence or importance would come by, they would chat. Some of them would actually sit for a minute or two. Some would sit for as much as 15 or 20 minutes. And there's an audio record of all of these conversations. They're very, very interesting. They're very personal in a lot of cases. And they're also very generous. The Rebbe is very with the people who are coming to consult him. I'll share with you two little events of Nicham Avelim which are particularly touching for me. The first is the Stolen Rebbe came. The Stolen Rebbe then was probably not 40. He probably wasn't 40 years old. He was a young man. He was destined to be a Rebbe before he was born. When the Friedrich Stolen passed, he had no sons. So he said, my first grandchild that is born with disfigured fingers, they have in their family disfigured, they have some kind of a genetic thing that they have people born with missing fingers, or some of the fingers are fused. I don't know exactly what it is. That's the next Rebbe. So as a newborn, he was a Rebbe. And in Stalin, this happened before. They called it a Yinuk. He was a Rebbe before he had a bris. Anyway, he came to see the Rebbe the second day, Thursday night. And he sat for a very short time, but it was very, very emotional. He sat down and he asked the Rebbe, how old was the Rebbitzen? There's two questions. And the Rebbitzen said, Jewish people don't count, but this Chafei Adar, she would have turned 87. And then he said to her, what did she pass away from? Which obviously he spoke to her in Yiddish. And the Rebbe started crying. And the Rebbe said, Von an Inyan Pnimi. Jede Histalkus is an Inyan Pnimi. I don't know if I have language to translate that. But basically it means from something spiritual, from something deep. Whenever a tzaddik passes, right, a regular person dies because the machine breaks down, tzaddikim pass because the neshama is lifted. It's a very different thing. Yeder Histalkus, whenever you have an event of Histalkus, it means a person who passes away, not because of the guf, but because of the neshama, which is of course only by big tzaddikim. There's a spiritual reason behind it. Yeder Histalkus and Impnimi. And then he said, Amokam, and he walked out. When he walked out, the Bacham said to him, well, why'd you make him cry? What's the point? He sat there 2 minutes. He has 2 questions and left. I'm sorry. So he said to them, this is just the minhag, this is the custom. I have seen more recently that when the Rebbe was Menachem Ovel, or the Gute Yidden, he asked the same 2 questions. Apparently this is the tradition. He asked how old and from what. So the Stoliner was a young boy. He was mamash a young man, but he came and he asked those 2 questions. The way the Rebbe greeted him is historic. The way the Rebbe greeted him is mind-blowing. I don't know of any other person that the Rebbe should greet this way. When he walked in, the Rebbe said to him, Ein ha'ovel eimed afilu b'fnei nasi b'Yisrael. An ovel doesn't stand up for anybody, even for a nasi b'Yisrael. The Rebbe said it to a boychik, an American-born Rebbe. And I don't know anybody else that the Rebbe would say that kind of thing to. I find it fascinating. I don't know the significance of it. I always ask Stolen Chassidim what they think of it. So they told me that as soon as he walked out of the Rebbe, he told his Gabbai, hello, the Chassidim, I'm not a Nasi. This was his reaction. But okay, anyway, the second event that I want to share when you get to the Shiva was the following. The Ger Rebbe lived in Israel. So he sent someone to represent him. Now, I don't know whether the Ger Rebbe told his representative what to say or didn't tell his representative what to say, but what happened is so interesting. Bichlal, when you come into a person like the Rebbe, you keep your mouth shut. You talk as little as possible. But by an ovel it's particularly true because according to halacha, the law is that the ovel is peseach. An ovel sits. You don't talk to him because he's mourning. If he wants to keep his mouth shut, that's his business. So you wait for him to open, to initiate. So the Gerer Shliach walks in, and the Rebbe begins that when a couple gets married, it's a binyan adayat. It's forever. Now remember, the Rebbitzen did not have children, which complicates matters, right? If you have children, And so the Rebbe says, binyan adayat means that since this expression is used in Torah, it's in the brachas of Sheva brachas, right? Binyan Adei Ad is one of the brachas that means every marriage is an eternal thing. So even when there's a physical interruption, the marriage continues forever. This is what the Rebbe tells him. Now, I don't know if he was listening or he wasn't listening, but he had a prepared speech. What was his prepared speech? That when the Friedrich Gere passed, when Mordechai Gere lost his wife, he was terribly, terribly broken. And he said things to the effect that I don't know how anybody can be consoled because this is an irreparable loss, and so on and so forth. So the Rebbe interrupts him and says, I just told you it's a binyan adayad. In other words, the Rebbe told him before he spoke the answer to what he was going to say, and basically he said, I don't want to hear what it is you have to say, because the message that he came with was, it's over and I'm sorry, and the Rebbe said, it ain't over. No, it's a binyan adayad. And you listen to the tape, it's very interesting, because the Rebbe sort of told him preemptively, if he was paying attention, he would have prepared a different speech, you understand, because the Rebbe clearly told him that I don't buy this idea that when a person passes, the marriage is over. And there are many, many allusions to this. Do you know that the Rebbe actually asked a Rav, after the Rebbitzen passed away, if he's still a son-in-law of the Friedrich Rebbe? And the Rav said yes, and the Rebbe said, prove it, and he had to come up with proof that it's forever, it's a bond that's forever. Anyway, the Rebbe opened his home, and people came in. I did not go into the Rebbe's house, I couldn't do it. In my wildest dreams, I could not imagine that after Shiva, the Rebbe's home would become a public place. The Rebbe's home was so private. Like I said, it wasn't even a part of our world. If I walked on President Street, I could not tell you which was the Rebbe's house. That, to such an extent, you didn't walk by the house, you understand? Unless you had special connections, and a lot of people had special connections, but more than those people didn't have those connections. So I was Menachem Avil in 770. The Rebbe came to Shul Shabbos, and on Shabbos he looked perfect. He looked just like himself. You didn't see any Aveils on the Rebbe. There was a Fabring in that Shabbat, and the Rebbe said a very long Maimer. And I remember thinking then that this is a portend of what's going to be. The Rebbe said a Maimer an hour, which is very, very long. I remember the Maimer, Zayit, a very, very, very long Maimer. And in my mind I was thinking, okay, so now the Rebbe is going to start saying longer Maimer, but I was wrong. It was exactly the opposite. During that year, the Rebbe slowly began to reduce the frequency of Maimorim. Instead of saying it every Shabbos, he started saying it only Shabbos Nevarchim. By the following Tishrei, the Rebbe ceased saying Maimorim completely. And then there was just a couple of times after that, the Rebbe stopped saying Maimorim. It works out to be about 5 years before Gimel Tammuz. The Rebbe stopped saying Maimorim, and the Friedrich Rebbe was exactly the same thing. 5 years before he passed away, he stopped writing and saying Maimorim, and the Maimorim that came out during those 5 years were old Maimorim that were redone. And in other words, when you're looking at hindsight, the Rebbe started reducing the frequency of the Maimorim and the length of the Maimorim. And then Tishrei, he said a couple of Maimorim, then he stopped. But that Shabbos was a very long Maimor. It was a Fabrengen. And at that Fabrengen, the Rebbe already spoke about making institutions to carry her name. And the Rebbe wanted people should start things right away. In the middle of Shiva, they made organizations, Keren Chomish and Beis Chomish, organizations that should carry the Rebbitzen's name. And the Rebbe encouraged people to do it as quickly as possible, and he thanked people. And I think the Rebbe said that he would participate. The Rebbitzen's name, Chaya Mushke, is the Gematria 470. Now, I gave you a bunch of pieces of paper, which evidently we're not going to get to, so it's going to be, for the most part, I don't want to call it a waste of paper, but this is very interesting material if you could read the Hebrew. But he wrote a letter to a Rav named Rabbi Tziner that the Rebbitzon's name is Chaya Mushke, which is 470, and 470 is the Gematria Eis, Ayin Tov. If anybody speaks Hebrew, you know that Eis means hour, time. There's a book in Tanakh called Keheles, Ecclesiastes. And one of the chapters of Keheles begins with Lakel Eis Uzman. Everything has a time. Eis means a time, an hour. And if you're familiar with Keheles, there's Chav Ches Itim. There are 28 times identified. Eis Ledabed, Eis Livkes, Eis Litzchak, a time to cry, a time to laugh, Eis Milchama, Eis Shalom, time for war, a time for peace. The whole piece, it's a few psukim, it's contrasts. So it's really 14 and 14. 14 on one side and 14 on the other. A time to speak, a time to be silent, and so on and so forth. So the Rebbe wrote to him that the Rebbitzen's name is the Gematria Eis, and added that the Rashi says that Eis doesn't mean an hour. Eis means a generation. Okay, Eis is man, that Eis means a dud. I'm seeing it for the first time now. I never saw this before, but it's in here on page 15 in your stack. Not the numbers on top, because there's a pamphlet that came out that's 48 pages long, and I copied pages intermittently, and I also didn't necessarily copy them in order. I copied them in the order in which I was going to read them with you, but I don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, so I was Menachem Aval after Shabbos in 770. It was a very surreal experience. The Rebbe davened Ma'ariv. I don't think he took off his shoes, or maybe he did take off his shoes for Ma'ariv. The Rebbe sat on a low stool, and he looked terrible. I've never seen the Rebbe. He looked terrible. He looked terrible. Shabbos, he looked so good. Looked to his old. He looked like a mourner. He looked terrible. The Rebbe looked terrible. And we all filed by. We Menachem Aval. The Rebbe sat on a low stool, and his eyes were fixed. You must understand that in anybody's relationship with the Rebbe, it was all about eye contact. You wanted to look into the eyes and have those eyes look back at you, because the eyes of the Rebbe, it's impossible to. If you haven't seen him, it's impossible to imagine. It's like two lasers. They were so powerful and they were so wise, and they said so much. The Rebbe's eyes spoke. They spoke joy. They spoke sadness. They spoke encouragement. They spoke compassion. The eyes of the Rebbe. I know this not because I heard it from other people, because I experienced it. The Rebbe's eyes were very, very. The Rebbe's eyes were. My relationship with the Rebbe is his eyes. The Rebbe spoke to him, but we looked at each other. He looked at me, and I looked at him for years, and this was our relationship. Those eyes. So we filed by. The Rebbe's eyes were fixed, and as you filed by, you wanted your eyes and his eyes to lock for an instant. As you were Menachem Aval. The Rebbe literally did not budge. The Rebbe sat. His eyes were fixed. And in other words, he didn't look at you. You had to pass in front of his radar. That's how he sat. And he was Menachem Aval many people. I remember Rabbi Groner was really upset because people were standing around. And the Rebbe said, he said, the Rebbe's sitting shivin. What are you looking at? The Rebbe's sitting, it's not the Fabrengen, but the Rebbe's sitting, go away, leave the man alone. Anyway, the Rebbe went back to his home and stayed in his home. The Shiva ended, of course, Tuesday morning, because Olavaya was on a Wednesday. And after the Shiva ended, so as the custom is, you console the mourners, you walk out and you walk back in, and you console the mourner again until the mourner stand up. So obviously, very prominent Lubavitcher Chassidim did this. They walked out, they walked back in, and they told the Rebbe to stand up, and they gave the Rebbe a bracha. The Rebbe stood up. And I think the Rebbe said immediately that the minig is that at the end of Shiva mishtalt mashke, you give mashke for Fabrengen. And by Minche, the Gabbai in the Rebbe's home announced that after Ma'ariv tonight it's going to be a Fabrengen in 770. And the Rebbe turns around in 770 where she lived. And this was the eye opener. In other words, we figured, okay, the Rebbe's sitting Shiva in his home, so when the Rebbe's home, Shiva is over, the Rebbe's house is locked. And the Rebbe said, no, make the Fabrengen here. And that's what happened. So that Tuesday night, there was a Fabrengen in the Rebbe's home, and it was very pushy, it was hard to get in. And the one thing that I remember from that Fabrengen, so I went in, but at this point I went in. In other words, I didn't go into the Rebbe's home because I figured if the Rebbe's home was only open for Shiva, then the Rebbe was going to close his house, and I just didn't want to go into space that I thought I was not welcome. But when the Rebbe made a Fabrengen in his home, so you couldn't stay all night because it was very pushy. People wanted to come in and people wanted to say L'chaim and so on. The thing that I recall from that Fabrengen, it's a funny thing to remember, but I think it's a lesson. Imagine you're sitting in the Rebbe's house Fabrengen and the Rebbe's upstairs. And there was a mic, the Rebbe could hear everything. Now, who's going to talk? Which Chacham is going to sit downstairs and Fabreng when you know that the Rebbe can hear every single word? And to be sure, in 770 it's the same thing, but somehow in 770 it was different because the Rebbe's room was not directly above the shul and the voice didn't carry. The sound didn't carry. But in the Rebbe's house, he was upstairs directly above us. There was a big staircase, the big hallway, there was no walls. The Rebbe could hear everything. And I remember Rabbi Weinberg, also Weinberg, sat and talked. And talked. And at the time, when I was 22 years old, I felt that this was inappropriate. But when I got older, I realized that you got to do what you got to do. The Rebbe wanted a Fabrengen. Fabrengen can't be nobody says anything because they're uncomfortable in front of the Rebbe. Someone has to speak. And in hindsight, I realized that he was doing what needed to be done. Under those conditions, there needed to be a Fabrengen, so he Fabrenged. That was it. And I think he wasn't the only one. I remember Zalman Grari also speaking. I didn't stay in the Rebbe's house that long because there were so many people who wanted to, the whole Lubavitch wanted to pile into the Rebbe's living room. And that was the beginning of a new era in Lubavitch. The Rebbe opened his home, and people davened with the Rebbe in his house 3 times a day. Most of us, I was in yeshiva, so I was in 770. All the Rebbe's tefillos were broadcast live on hookup, so we would daven in 770 at the same time as the Rebbe davened. And if you wanted, you could have put a chazan, but we answered Kaddish, Kedusha. We davened with the Rebbe all the tefillos, Shachas Mincha Ma'ariv every single day. A few memories of that year are, number one, the Rebbe stopped Fabrengen during the week at all. Completely forgot. Stopped. No more. There were no more weekday Fabrengens. The last weekday Fabrengen was Tu B'Shvat, which was also a Tuesday night. Exactly 1 week before the Rebbitzen passed away, the Rebbe Fabrengen. That Sikha, the Rebbe was busy editing when the Rebbitzen went to the hospital. And when the Rebbitzen passed away, that morning the Rebbe gave out that Sikha for print in the hours right after the Rebbitzen passed away. The Rebbe stopped Fabrengen during the week, altogether. The Shabbos Fabrengens also changed very quickly and very radically. Everything was suddenly shortened. A lot. You know, a typical Shabbos Fabrengen in my years was 2.5 or 3 hours. All of a sudden it was 1.5 hours. Very short. The Rebbe could come in at 5 to 2, and by 3:15 the whole thing was over. But the Rebbe started speaking weekday sichas, and this became the new staple. Either after Mincha or after Maariv, just turn around and start to talk. And it wasn't like he gave notice, so it became very difficult for ordinary people. If you're a lay person, if you're not a yeshiva bacher, what are you supposed to do? Live in 770? So they developed all kinds of systems. They had beepers, they had alarms. That same alarm that the rings for Erev Shabbos would sound when the Rebbe was going to say a Sikha. And people started to buy hookup lines. If you lived a little away from 770, by the time you'd get to 770, the Sikha was over. So you would make a hookup line, and you'd open the phone on, and you could listen to the Rebbe speak simultaneously 3 blocks from 770, because by the time you'd get to 770, he'd be done. And the Rebbe would speak very frequently in the evenings, sometimes for 5 or 10 minutes, sometimes for 40 minutes, sometimes for an hour. In other words, I would say all told, the Rebbe didn't speak less than he had spoken before, but he divided it up into more and more occasions. And of course, at this point in the Rebbe's Nesius, every time the Rebbe spoke, he handed out dollars. And you can get as many times as you wanted, you got $1. In other words, on some days, the Rebbe can give you $1 because of Sunday dollars, and if he spoke after Mincha, there's $1 after Mincha. If he spoke after Ma'ariv, $1 after Ma'ariv. And nobody said he can't go. Anybody who wanted went. Obviously, a lot of people, most people had seichel not to go every time. The Rebbe would have never finished. So guests would go and so on. But every time the Rebbe spoke, the Rebbe handed out dollars. That Tuesday, which was the end of Shiva, after Mincha, the Rebbe again spoke a much longer Sikha, which is edited, and he handed out dollars. And like I said, after Ma'ariv, that night there was a Fabreng. The Sikha that I want to reference was actually after Shachris. See, this was the unusual thing about it. Since the Rebbe was at home, and we were in shul, in other words, since it was not a Fabreng, and a Fabreng, and I always stood in the same place. But now, wherever you happened to be standing and the Rebbe's voice came on, you stopped. So I remember exactly where I stood. Where were you when this happened? You know, that kind of thing. So I have many memories of post-Manches, after the Rebbe passed away, where I associate a Sikha with a place. Because I remember where I was standing. And it was about 10 after 11 in the morning. And I remember we were going to learn Gemara. We davened at 10 o'clock. Davening, by the way, in 7-7 used to be 9:30 during the week. After the Rebbe passed away, 2 changes took place. Number 1, it changed to 10 o'clock. And number 2, the Rebbe started davening with the minyan. Until the Rebbe passed away, the Rebbe davened Ma'ariv and Mincha and Ma'ariv with the minyan. Shachas, the Rebbe davened b'yechidus by himself, except Shabbos and Yom Tif, and a few more days, Tisha B'Av, Purim, and Yortzeit, and Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. After the Rebbe passed away, davening was moved from 9:30 to 10, and the Rebbe davened every day with the minyan. So it was about 10 after 11, so the Rebbe's voice comes on. So you ran, you get your hat, your jacket. I remember where I was studying near the Pushka, right in the very, very back of the shul. And that's when the Rebbe introduced the idea of Yom Holedes. It was the Rebbitzen's birthday. which was a month and a couple of days after her Shloshim. And the Rebbe spoke a Sikha then that there's a minig by Chassidim Bechlal to celebrate birthdays, but in her schus the Rebbe made it into an official mitzvah. I just remember how personal it was. And then after Pesach, Achad Shal Pesach, the Rebbe spoke about birthdays again, and then he gave out the minhagim of birthdays. The official birthday of the minig of birthdays is the first birthday after the Rebbitzen, of our Rebbitzen after she passed away. Another thing which I remember, and this is very poignant, and this would repeat itself, and people aren't Mason Lev. The Rebbe spoke in public about himself in a very personal way, many times. And again, when you listen to the Rebbe talk, unless he cried, which happened, you didn't appreciate that it was personal unless you thought about what he was saying. Shloshim, when the Shloshim ended, the Rebbe spoke. I think it was after Mincha. I don't think it was after Maide, but I may be wrong. And the Rebbe spoke. So it was Chaf Aleph Adar, 1988, Chaf Aleph Adar, and it was Pashas Parah that week. So the Rebbe spoke about Pashas Parah Aduma. And this was what the Rebbe said. The Rebbe said that a period of mourning passes, of Avelis ends. And the halacha says that you have to stop to mourn. But you don't feel like stopping to mourn. You want to continue mourning. So the Torah teaches you a lesson, Zeis Chukas HaTorah, that some things you have to do like a choik. In other words, you have to accept the judgment of the Torah. The Torah says stop mourning. You don't want to stop. And Torah says you must. So you don't do it because it makes sense to you, or it sits right with you, it feels right with you. You do it because the Eibishter said. Now you could hear this sikh on a tape. The Rebbe didn't cry, but it was very personal. The Rebbe Poshet was articulate. He was sharing with everybody his aveilus, his mourning, and his struggle. Yeah. Another sikh during that period, which I remember, was the Gimel Nissen. It was a Gimel Nissen, and again, I remember where I was standing, where the Rebbe discussed an interesting story in Chumash Rashi. Also a similar theme, where Aaron's two sons are killed. Another one of them were killed in a fire because they had brought Zod in the Beis HaMikdash. And Moshe tells Aaron HaKohen that he should continue doing the service, he shouldn't sit Shiva, he shouldn't be Menah, he shouldn't do Avelos, he shouldn't do Aninus, he should do the right in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Jewish people will mourn for him. So what Aaron HaKohen does, he tells what Moshe Rabbeinu tells him to do, but only to the letter of the law. Anything more than Moshe Rabbeinu told to do explicitly, he acted like a mourner. And Moshe gets upset at him. But he doesn't direct his frustration towards him, he directs the frustration towards the remaining two sons. He screams at them and says, I told you that you shouldn't mourn. And Aaron didn't mourn, but he didn't mourn only in those areas that Moshe told him explicitly not to. Anything that Moshe did not explicitly state that he shouldn't mourn, he acted as a mourner when it came to those things. So Moshe gets angry. Another one of Aaron's sons are not going to speak in front of Moshe. So Aaron answers. Moshe directs his protest to the children, and the father says. And basically what he says, I'm a mourner. I'm a mourner. And you told me I shouldn't mourn, so I didn't mourn about those things specifically you told me, but otherwise, I mourned. So the Rebbe explained the dialogue. I'm skipping steps because it's technical, but the dialogue went like this. Moshe Rabbeinu was, in effect, a heavenly creature. Heavenly creature means he lived in God's world. In God's world, all you do is what God wants. So mourning is a commandment, just like dancing is a commandment, and bringing a carbon is a commandment, and eating the carbon is a commandment, and not bringing the carbon is a commandment. It's all the same. Okay, I'm sorry. I want to put Facebook back on here. Okay, it says my phone is overheating. Okay, so whatever they got. Yeah, Mrs. Happy, you're still here. Okay, see, it ain't my fault. It ain't my fault. My phone just decided not to let us continue. I'll wait a few minutes to put it back on. I was on the internet until now. Anyway, so the Rebbe said, Aaron says to Moshe. So Moshe says to Aaron, I told you not to mourn. Which means the same God that says you're supposed to be sad said not to be sad. What's the difference? So Aaron says to Moshe, and this is what the Rebbe explained, that Avelus, mourning, and Aminus is an emotion. And a person can't simply turn their feelings off. So you told me I should suppress my natural emotions. I did. But I only did it to the extent that you instructed. Otherwise, I'm a human being. I lost sons. I'm very sad and very broken, so I mourned. And the way the story finishes is Vayishma Moshe Vayitav, and Moshe heard, and he agreed that Aaron was right. So what the Rebbe explained was, Moshe told Aaron what the Torah says. Aaron explained to Moshe what the Torah means. Why? Because Aaron played out the mitzvahs as a person. And the Rebbe explained, when a person is doing Avelos, they're not just doing a ritual of sadness. They're sad. And you can't just shut those emotions down. That's what I said. You can't just shut those emotions down. Now, again, at the time that I heard the Sikha, I was 22. I was very not smart. I thought I was brilliant, but I really was very not smart. In hindsight, when I look at it now, when I look at it now, I understand that Rebbe was Pasha describing to us his Avelos. It was Pasha very personal. And there were other occasions, I just mentioned two examples, where the Rebbe spoke to all the Chassidim in the whole world during the week on a hookup, men, women, and children, and he was Pasha talking, he was sharing with us his Avelos. I don't know what to say. We should have been more mentioned. I don't know what the right wording is. Whatever it is, this is just what happened. In this stack, which I haven't gotten to, there's a very, very powerful and compelling and upsetting response. I'll tell you what page it's on. I guess we'll make the papers have some use. It's on page 20. In Torah, in Gemara, and in Chazal, there is something called Eishes Neurim. Eishes Neurim means the first wife, a wife of one's youth. Yeah, a young boy, a young girl get married and they grow up together. Yeah, you can't replace an Eishes Neurim. You can't have a second first wife. There's no such thing. This is true psychologically, and it's especially true mystically, because according to Kabbalah, a husband and a first wife, they're one person. A second marriage is an accommodation. In other words, the mystical concept of the bonding of a man and a woman is because they're essentially one, right? They're first one, then they're separated, and then they're reunified. But this is true only in the first marriage. So the Gemara says in Histalkus that if a person divorces his first wife, the world cries. The person divorces his first wife, the world cries. Even the Mizbeach, the altar, cries. So it's in Torah, the bond between a man and his first wife, or a woman and a couple gets married, they've never been married before. Okay, let's not complicate matters. This is very unusual, it's very deep, it's very special. And the way I always tell you girls, right, there's only one rule about marriage, you're supposed to do it only once. And if you're married to do it only once, you know what it means. You live with a person for decades and you should become one person. It's the deepest. There's no relationship that even comes anywhere near it. It's not like there are other relationships that are comparable. There's nothing like it. A marriage is a marriage. And it's when it's the way it's supposed to be, it's extraordinary. So the Gemara says that when a person loses his wife, there are alternatives, like Torah. Right? It says, the Pasuk says, you should see life with the woman who you love, which is usually translated as Eishes Neurim, as a first marriage, but the Gemara says Torah, that it goes under Torah. And there's actually history. There's history to this. What's the history? That when the Tzemach Tzedek lost his wife, right, the only other Chabad Rebbe to be predeceased by his wife was the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek had the same name. The Rebbitzen and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbitzen had the same name. It's very ironic. But when Tzemach Tzedek lost his wife, he was shattered. He was devastated. And they couldn't console him. And his children said, trying to console him, and he said to his children, you had a mother of the flesh, and now you have a mother in Gan Eden. I need her. The Tzemach Tzedek said when he lost his Rebbitzen, my world has gone dark. he was very dependent on her, and I'm sure there's human components to this, but there's clearly deep spiritual components to this as well. So somebody came to the Tzemach Tzedek, to the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, but this must have been a somebody who could have said this, and he told the Tzemach Tzedek about this Gemara, that the Chayim im Ha'isha asher ahavta zu Torah, you'll find life with the woman that you love is the Torah. So the Tzemach Tzedek answered him, Nichamtani, you actually consoled me. So there was a Jew whose name is very famous in the Jewish world. His name was Harav Zevin, Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, who passed away in the 70s, and he was in his 90s. He lost his first wife in the 1950s, and he remarried. His second wife came to the Rebbe after he passed away in 1977, I think. He lost his first wife. The Rebbe was very connected to Rabbi Zevin, very connected. Rabbi Zevin was a real chassid of the Rebbe, even though he was probably closer to the Frierdiker Rebbe's age than he was to the Rebbe's age. And the Rebbe wrote him a letter and told him this story in the letter. It's printed. When Tzemach Tzedek lost his wife, he was very broken, and someone came to him and said to him, you can find life with the woman that you love goes on the Torah. The Tzemach Tzedek said, Nichamtani, you consoled me. So the Rebbe tells the story to Rabbi Zevin, and then he writes, Tzemach Tzedek didn't know the Gemara. Tzemach Tzedek needs somebody else tell him that this Gemara exists. And the Rebbe was saying to Rabbi Zevin, I know you know this Gemara. Rabbi Zevin knew the whole Torah, literally. But the Gemara says, Ein chovosh materes atzami mebeisa asurim. A prisoner cannot redeem himself. When you're in prison, someone else has to redeem you. So although Tzemach Tzedek knew the Gemara, when somebody else told it to him, it gave him something. So the Rebbe writes, Rabbi Zevin, I am there for telling it to you. In other words, the Rebbe knew that Rabbi Zevin knows this Gemara, but nevertheless, so someone tried to do that to the Rebbe. But apparently, you got to be the right kind of guy to say it, or you got to be saying it to the right kind of recipients. So the Rebbe writes back, and the manuscript is above, and below you have the Hebrew on page 20. Yeah, Karasi Hanal Kaposhut. I read what you wrote, and it's obvious. I got similar notes from many people who are telling me that I can find peace and I can find happiness and find consolation in Torah and so on. You mean well, and I appreciate it. Klot kashe, but there's still a question. You apparently forgot what the Gemara discusses at length the kind of bond there is between a husband and a wife, and how impossible it is to recover from that. So the Rebbe says, I got it, I heard what you said, but if you look at the Gemara Sanhedrin, you realize it's not so simple. In other words, the Rebbe didn't take it. He didn't react like the Tzemach Tzedek reacted. Now, I don't know if the difference is because the Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek are different people, or because the person who told it to the Rebbe was not the same kind of person as the person who told it to the Tzemach. You can't send a schlock to tell the Rebbe personal advice. You have to send somebody. There was nobody who could the Rebbe advise. There was nobody around who was at that level. But Tzemach Tzedek was a very different time. And the Rebbe said, I just don't... Point well taken, but I'm not taking the point. In other words, I'm broken, I'm sad, it's not stopping. It's not stopping because you sent me this message, you understand? So this is the story. Anyway, but the last thing I want to say, and it's past 12:20, and I need to go, and you need to go. The story of Chavei Shvat, more than anything else, is the fact that as soon as the Rebbitzen passed away, the Rebbe made her a public figure. A woman who shunned any kind of public recognition, who ran from honor physically. The day she passed away, the Rebbe gave her to us. And it's quite clear. There was a Yid named Jacobson, the father of the Jacobsons, who had the Allgemeine Journal. And that the Rebbe passed away Wednesday, so Friday the paper came out, and he must have reprinted the paper, because usually a newspaper that comes out on Friday is printed by Wednesday, it was a weekly. So the whole thing was on the Rebbitzen. And he published pictures of her, a few pictures of her. When he walked by the Rebbe told him, thank you for the pictures. But as time passed, it became very clear that the Rebbe gave us a Rebbitzen that for whatever reasons, during her physical lifetime, none of us had. All of a sudden, she became the Rebbitzen. You must understand, the Rebbitzen is more prevalent in my life now than she was when she was here. She was literally out of sight, out of mind. And now wherever you look, there's pictures of her, we talk about her. We'll just name our children now. We tell stories about her, and it's so hard to find stories because little bits and pieces are coming out slowly, over the years. The Rebbe wanted the Rebbitzen to be a public figure. There's no question about it in my mind. And the reason the Rebbe wanted the Rebbe to be a figure is very simple, because the Rebbe felt and feels that if all of us, especially women, will relate to her, there'll be better people and better Jews and better Chassidim. And the Rebbe gave us the Rebbitzen that we didn't have while she was physically alive, the day she passed away. And then for the next 4 years, next 5 years, 4 years, he would push and push and push the celebration of her personage and really the continuation of her life, even though physically the Rebbe had passed away. I mean, the sichas that the Rebbe said about her is extra. Really, I mean, the Rebbe spoke about her almost like she was a Rebbe. Really, the Rebbe elevated her. The Rebbe spoke about his Rebbitzen like as if she was one of the holiest people ever. And the Rebbe didn't do it because that was emotional. He did it because it was the truth. And the Rebbe told somebody that people underestimated who she was. People just didn't know her. The Rebbe said, only the Eibishter knows. God knows how great she was. The Rebbe said that. This is the story. And I'll just finish with one thing. I'll give you this version of it, although there's so many versions of it. My son married a girl from Ottawa. The family name is Ketak. So the chasana took place last summer now. We spent a week there. And Mrs. Devorah Ketak, who's probably here, and she's a graduate of this school, was learning in this school in the 1970s. I don't know if you know, my Mechatena says she's very forward. If she was a business lady, she'd be very, very, very rich. She happens to be a shlucha, so she's very, very rich with mitzvahs. But she's not at all reticent and hesitant and apologetic. She's very forward, very strong, very outspoken. So she got another girl to join her in basically inviting themselves to the Rebbitzins' house. She wrote a letter, and the two of them signed it. And what she wrote in the letter was she explained to me her life. Her friends all thought she was out of her mind. Her parents were few with her. She'd given up so much to be Jewish. And she wrote to the Rebbitzen, I don't know if she said it in the letter, but what she told me, I felt I was entitled. I was entitled to get to the top. So she wrote a letter, they signed it, they went to the house, they put it in the mailbox, and they ran away. The cook in our school, was a personal friend of the Rebbitzen, and a day or two later she calls her over and said, did you send a letter to the Rebbitzen? So she thought that she was going to be reprimanded, and she very sheepishly said yes, and she said, well, the Rebbitzen wants to see you. And they came to see the Rebbitzen. And just what I described, the Rebbitzen was beautifully dressed, the table was set, she served them whatever it was, but she served them what she felt young single women would enjoy. And she chatted with them for a while, must have been an hour. She talked to them for a long time. And the things she didn't talk about religion, she didn't talk about the Eibishter, she didn't ask them how she became frum. She just chatted with them. She talked to them. She asked them what music they like and what their hobbies are. And the lesson that she took, that my Mechatenista took, and this is something that you need to have a little bit of wisdom to appreciate. The Rebbitzen was one of those ladies who, first of all, she managed every conversation. You never got where she didn't want you to go. She never talked about herself. She was off limits. You were on the table. She could ask any question she wanted. And she was very involved in the personal lives of many people in a very personal way. But you never discussed her. She managed. The Rebbitzen was the kind of lady who shared with you what she wanted to share with you. And every person had a different relationship. And she decided what we're talking about. The woman who told me that she was very turned off by the Rebbitzen. I said, why? All she wanted to discuss was fashion. And I felt that he was shallow. Now, what this lady didn't understand, which we now understand, and you can speak to people, was the Rebbitzen talked to her about fashion because that was as far as she was going to go with this lady, maybe because that lady was shallow. The Rebbitzen, every relationship that she had, she managed. And there were people who she spoke about very deep things, very religious things, and the people but when she spoke to women and girls, it was very common for her to talk about domestic things. And there's a lady whose name is Mrs. Hager, Louise Hager from London, who she knew the Rebbe from childhood. She was as a girl yet. And she said what the Rebbitzen was doing, she wasn't making small talk, she wasn't chatting, she was teaching. She says, I grew up in the 70s, I was a liberated woman, I was a feminist. And the Rebbitzen was teaching me, in all the conversations they had with her, the value of domesticity, how beautiful and how valuable and how meaningful it is to have a home, and that the home should be beautiful, and that the children should be dressed right. People used to come into their house, and she would look through what they bought in the store, and she would discuss. She involved herself in people's what is the word I'm looking for? In the what they call it menus, what they're going to feed their families. She wasn't just chatting because she had nothing else to talk about. The Rebbitzen was a brilliant. She was the Frierdiker Rebbe's daughter. She had an incredible IQ. She was well educated. She spoke many languages. She read in many languages. She wrote in many languages, and she had an incredible amount of information in her head. She was an engineer. She was a mathematician. She knew how to learn Torah, and she talked to people about cooking. Not because she didn't want to talk about anything else, because she was teaching. She was teaching people. And I think the thing which you have to take away from her in general, but especially as women, she personified, she was the prototype of the fusion between religion and humanity, and humanness. That being frum doesn't mean not being a person. To the contrary, the most human of human beings is a human being who's connected to Hashem. And in her, this was manifest, this was revealed, it was played out so completely that all you saw was person. You didn't see the holiness, you didn't see the religious side, but you did see the holiness, you did see the religious side, because there was no conflict. And this is probably more than anything else what she taught and what she teaches. Yeah, bichlal, but especially to women, is that normal is holy, it's Jewish, it's beautiful, it's good, it's right. And she taught it by her example, she taught it by the way she talked to people, and so forth and so on.